I'm so looking forward to exploring together this idea of how we can choose to live our lives using freedom rather than fear and control in our personal lives, in our workplace, and in the world that we live in today. And I want to begin by telling you a story about a good friend of mine named Matt. He was the person who really taught me about how to overcome fear. I met Matt shortly after I graduated from college. Matt was one of those guys that everybody loves. You know those kinds of people? They're filled with joy and they're inspiring and they're very spiritual, deep thinker. That's how my friend Matt was. Everyone loved being around him, including me. Matt became a trusted friend, advisor, and mentor to me. And at one point, Matt and I were invited to fly down to Monterrey, Mexico, to go to a conference on emerging leaders from around the world. And we're on the plane ride down there, and we're talking, and Matt turns to me and he says, "Traci, you know what I'm working on these days?" I'm like, "What?" He says, "I'm working on not being afraid of anything." And I'm pretty sure I looked flabbergasted because I'd never heard anyone say that. I had never thought myself about working on fear or even becoming aware of it. But he looks at me and he says, "I'm working on not being afraid of anything." Well, this was deeply inspiring to me, and over the months that followed, I watched Matt's example and I learned from him. And about 6 months later, some friends and I were with Matt. We were all having coffee together, and after coffee, we all gave each other hugs goodbye, and he looked at my friends and I, and he said, "You know, I finally realized that I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of anything anymore. I'm not even afraid of dying." And he had this look on his face that was so just resplendent, and it was just inspiring to see this example. Well, that was the last time I saw my friend Matt, because a week later, he was killed in a car accident coming home from vacation. And as you can imagine, I was devastated by this news, but I also was inspired because I knew that he was soaring on without fear, and I could continue to take his example forward. Shortly thereafter, I moved to Washington, D.C., and was a full-time graduate student. I had just started WorldBlu. I was working for the NASDAQ stock market, and my whole life became a blur of travel and work and school and startup business and everything. And I started to feel really off-center. And I ended up calling a new mentor of mine and spilled my heart out to her. And she listened, and then she quietly said, "Traci, what would you do if you weren't afraid? What would you do if you weren't afraid?" And that was the first time anyone had ever asked me that. And in that moment, I went from feeling completely powerless to totally powerful. Because isn't that what fear does? It makes us feel helpless and powerless. But when we see how we can overcome it, we feel back in our power again. And so I call it the power question, because that's exactly what it does for us when we ask it. And we can apply the power question, "What would I do if I weren't afraid?" to any challenge we face, from small to large. We can apply it to any decision we have to make. We can apply it to any opportunity before us. And that's what I invite you to do. So I started WorldBlu 20 years ago, and I've had the great privilege of working with companies from small all the way up to Fortune 500s in about 80 countries worldwide. And we've been teaching this idea of freedom and democracy in the workplace, and I've learned so much along the way. And recently, we've codified the research and the experience and the learning into something we call the Freedom at Work model. And the Freedom at Work model has 3 parts to it. The first part is a freedom-centered mindset. A freedom-centered mindset. The second part is freedom-centered design, the way we design our organizations to operate. And the third part is called freedom-centered leadership. Now, over the years, I have seen companies waste thousands, if not millions of dollars in initiatives to change the way their organization works or improve the way their people lead without ever touching mindset. And because we don't talk about mindset, these initiatives are often not effective or sustainable. But it really does start with mindset. And I commend all of you for understanding that. That's why we're here and that's what we're talking about, is how to cultivate the mindset, how to till the soil of our thought to be ready to receive these ideas. Now, how important is mindset? Well, research tells us that we think on average 60,000 thoughts a day. 60,000 thoughts a day. Guess how many of those thoughts are negative and fear-based? 80%. 80% of our thinking is negative and fear-based. So anyone who thinks, oh, mindset doesn't matter, it matters. It absolutely matters. So we have to make that mindset shift. And the power question enables us to do it in a heartbeat. And that's the good news. We can change our minds. And it doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be difficult at all. Now, when I'm talking about overcoming fear, I'm not talking about, the kind of fear that tells you don't go walking down that dark alley. That's not a good move. I'm not talking about overcoming that fear, right? I'm talking about the fear that tries to limit our full potential and purpose in life. That's the fear that we're talking about overcoming today. And I think when we talk about fear, we need to be able to become more aware of how fear influences our lives. We need to be willing to be vulnerable and authentic in talking about it. And we also need to understand that fear is not a motivator. I was talking with a friend of mine, actually a friend of mine emailed me just a week ago. And he said to me, Traci, I'd like you to come and speak at a conference I'm doing in a country over in Europe. I'd like you to come speak at this conference. And he said, but here's the deal. I don't want you to talk about fear because business leaders in our country aren't afraid. It's literally what he wrote me in the email. I don't want you to talk about fear because business leaders in our country are not afraid. And I thought, dang, I want to move to this country. This sounds pretty good. Okay, so we have to become aware that there's fear going on in our lives. And that starts by recognizing the symptoms of fear. Stress, anger, push, hurry, fiefdoms, command and control, bureaucracy, all of these are symptoms of fear. And until we get at the root of it, we're not going to actually solve the problem. Now, I like to think of fear like the old 1950s comic book character, Plastic Man. Has anyone ever heard of Plastic Man before? So Plastic Man can't fly, and he doesn't have an invisible cape. But what Plastic Man is able to do is to shape shift and bend and change the way he looks and make himself look like a tree or a chair or whatever he wants to look like in order to blend into the environment around him. And I think that that's kind of how fear works. It likes to be a shapeshifter and weasel its way into our thinking and into our life. And often we don't even realize it. I know that happens in my thinking all the time. And I'll be going through something or ruminating through something, and then I'm like, oh my goodness, this is total fear, duh. But there goes Plastic Man. About 2 months ago, I was having lunch with my nephew, Tyler. He's 9 years old, cute as a button, high emotional intelligence, athlete. Everybody loves this kid. We're out to lunch, and he knows I'm the auntie that kind of likes to have the deeper conversations, So we're sitting there eating our sandwiches, and I said, Tyler, 9 years old, I'm curious. What does it mean to you to be a man? And we've been talking about all the basketball, stars and everything, so I kind of want to know where his thinking is going on this. So I said, Tyler, what does it mean to you to be a man? And he sits back in his seat and he's, chewing his sandwich. And he goes, well, Aunt Traci, it means to be strong, like physically strong. And it means to not be afraid. It means to not be afraid. So at 9 years old, he had already figured out that for me to be a man, I sure as heck better not show emotion or vulnerability around fear. I'm supposed to always have it together. And Brené Brown has done some amazing research on this, on vulnerability and authenticity, and how when we are authentic about our emotions and our feelings, that actually makes us stronger, and it allows those around us to step up to the plate and help us out. So part of having a conversation around fear is being able to be vulnerable and authentic, and that's a wonderful thing. Now, I've had a lot of leaders and CEOs say to me, well, Traci, I kind of like it if my people are a little afraid of me. I know I'm not supposed to say that, but it's kind of how I feel sometimes. I was talking with the president of a company recently, and I said to him, so on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, what do you think is the level of fear in your workplace right now? And he said, I think we're at about an 8, so it's not that bad. I thought, oh my goodness, I don't know that I would want to work in a workplace like that. But so then I asked him, I said, well, what level of fear would you like to see? And he said, well, maybe a 2 or 3, because I still want my people to hustle. And I appreciated his honesty. Because I think a lot of people think that way, that they need fear in their own life. I'm never going to get anything done if I don't have a little fear in me, right? That fear is a motivator. But what the brain research tells us is that when we're in fear, whether it's low-grade or high-grade levels of fear, the peripheries of our brain shut down and we become myopic. And we're actually not able to function fully. It literally makes us dumb when we're in fear. It's not a motivator. It doesn't help us move forward. So in order to talk about fear, we have to be aware of it. We have to be willing to be vulnerable, and we have to understand it's not a motivator. Now what I want to touch on is fear and freedom and the power question applied at a personal level, workplace, and global level. Back in January of 2012, I sat down with my team and I thought I was being a good CEO. We sat down and came up with all of our different goals and attached deadlines to all those goals for the year and all of our benchmarks and all of that. And off we went, charging into the new year. And at about mid-February, it felt like things just weren't really clicking or flowing like they needed to, and everything kind of felt like a grind. And I definitely was feeling like, oh man, this feels really difficult right now. So one February day, a good friend of mine called me up and she said, hey Traci, can I come by? I gotta drop off some Tupperware. I'm like, sure, no problem. And I'm thinking, make it snappy because I've got some goals and things I gotta get done, right? You know, that feeling, let's move it along, time is ticking. So my friend comes by and we're standing in the door talking. Just having a quick casual conversation, and all of a sudden, I have this sharp pain in my chest. I can't breathe. My eyes fill with tears. I grab her arm. All I can say is pray. And I was in so much pain. I thought, what the heck is going on right now? And I'm a very spiritual person, and just kind of asked the universe, wow, what's going on in my mindset that needs to shift? And the thought that came to me was, Traci, you are totally stressed out. And I thought, no, I'm not. I'm not afraid. I'm not stressed out. I'm living a balanced life. I just went for a run with my dog. I did my yoga. I'm not stressed out. But what I realized were that all of the deadlines and goals were creating this, and they were so arbitrary. They're so arbitrary. We're creating this push, push, push energy. And it was exhausting. And the moment I saw that, the fear just completely left, and the pain completely left. And I thought to myself, well, what would I do if I weren't afraid? I'd let go of all of these arbitrary deadlines. There were a couple we needed to keep. But I let go, and I trust my team, and I trust myself that we could be in the flow to get this done. And the next day I called my team and got everybody on the phone together and said, hey, what do you all think about this idea? And it was like we experienced a collective release of fear. And since that moment, everything has just been straight up, and it's just been wonderful. But even more than that, I ask myself the power question every day and have for probably 15 years now. But that particular occasion, something shifted in me. Something shifted in my character. And I felt the frenetic energy that I had had so long as an entrepreneur kind of just left. And there was a peace and a calm that came over me that has never left. And that was so transformational for me on a personal level. So I ask you to think, on a personal level, what would you do if you weren't afraid? Now, in the workplace, let's talk about the power question applied there. There's been some new research published in the Harvard Business Review. And you know what it says are the top 3 fears of leaders? Number 1, fear of the imposter syndrome. Anyone ever feel this way? Where you're like, I'm totally faking it, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, and I pray to God that no one figures it out. Anyone know that feeling? Yes? Number 1, fear, imposter syndrome. Number 2, fear of failure. Anyone know that one? Have you ever experienced that? I don't want to try, because what if I fail? And the number 3 fear is fear of being seen as vulnerable. Fear of being seen as vulnerable. And the leaders and CEOs that they interviewed for this said that they felt that 95% of their executive team members didn't even realize the level of fear that they had. Didn't even realize it. And then they went on to identify over 500 negative consequences that came because of that fear-based mindset. 500 negative consequences in the workplace. Guess what the number 1 negative consequence was? Bad decisions. Bad decisions. I have a friend named Mike who runs a technology company in Washington, D.C. And I met Mike several years ago at a point where the company was struggling. He was struggling physically as a leader, having lots of headaches, feeling in pain. And he just couldn't seem to get his team to shift to that next level. And we started doing some work together. And over time, he was working with his colleagues and hoping that they would make the shift from a mindset of fear to a mindset of freedom. But unfortunately, most of them were not willing or able to make that shift. And so at one point, he had to make the hard decision as a leader, asking himself what he would do if he weren't afraid. And he let probably about 3/4 of his team go. Tough decision, but he knew it was the right thing to do. He got a team around him that had a freedom-centered mindset, positive, upbeat, ready to go. That team moved into a brand new office space, beautiful, democratic, transparent space. They invented an entirely new technology that I just found out this morning is going to be worth about $10 million. And they've had 150% in revenue growth. So just him having the courage to say, what would I do if I weren't afraid, has made a dramatic impact on the bottom line and growth of his company. WorldBlu recently released a white paper, and we talked about the bottom line impact of freedom versus fear in the workplace. And we did a revenue analysis. We looked at the S&P 500 companies over a 3-year period, and we compared their revenue growth to WorldBlu certified freedom-centered companies. WorldBlu certified freedom-centered companies had revenue growth not double, not triple, but almost 7 times higher than the average company in the S&P 500 because of their commitment to operating from freedom rather than fear and control. So I ask you to consider, what would you do in your workplace if you weren't afraid? What would you do in your workplace if you weren't afraid? And lastly, I want to talk about the global level. We don't have to look very far to see the level of fear happening, not just in this country, but all over the world on a political level, economic level, social, cultural. There are a lot of problems that need to be solved. And so many of these systems are driven by fear. I feel that there's an epidemic of fear going on in the world right now. But I'm inspired by people like my friend John. John had a pretty cushy life living in the United States, a successful career, and one day, through a series of events, decided to move to Haiti. And he moved to Haiti and he started a nonprofit organization there that has helped shift and change the economic and cultural and social dimensions of this country in his own way. He's touching and changing the lives of thousands of people because he decided to think, wow, how can I make an impact on a much more global level? And so I ask you to think about, what would you do for the world if you weren't afraid? What might you do for the world if you weren't afraid? The famous English poet David Whyte once wrote, I want you to know this one thing. I want you to know this one thing. The world was made to be free in. The world was made to be free in. As we think about overcoming fear on a personal level, workplace, in the world, I invite you to remember this. I believe it is our right to achieve our full potential and purpose in the world. And that starts by overcoming fear. So I ask you, what would you do if you weren't afraid? Thank you.